Thank you very much. Well, thank you very, very much for coming. I'm Bob Mary. I'm editor of the American Conservative magazine, and I want to welcome all of you. We're delighted to see so many sharp, shiny faces here for this program, which is the first program that we had on the question of crony capitalism, sometimes referred to as corporate welfare. Some people don't like the term crony capitalism for reasons I've never totally understood. But nevertheless, TAC, as we call ourselves at the American Conservative, we've committed ourselves to major coverage on this subject. And so this is a sort of first event designed as a statement of that commitment. I think we have a splendid discussion in store. We have some true experts in this field. But first, a little bit of historical perspective. Crony capitalism in America, I can state definitively, goes back at least as far as the Boston Tea Party. Most people don't know this. I didn't know it until I read an article in my forthcoming magazine, which goes to press today, by Allison Winters, who's here today, in which she noted that the Boston Tea Party actually was a protest against a tax cut. I thought it was about tax increases and high taxes. It seems that this tax cut was perpetrated for one company exclusively, the East India Company, otherwise known as EIC, which apparently in that period, in the 1770s, wasn't doing very well. And of course, London considered it too big to fail. So they gave the EIC dispensation on all taxes on tea imported into the colonies, which guaranteed the East India Company a virtual monopoly and crushed American importers and tea merchants. Now, this is the kind of thing we're talking about, and it goes back all the way there. There's also a tradition in America which I know a little bit about because I wrote a book some years ago about James Polk, and I got into that whole period of whole issue about tariffs and Andrew Jackson and whatnot. And the great anti-crony capitalism American politician of that period was Andrew Jackson, about whom I wrote in the last issue of TAC. And I'm not going to go into very much about that, but by way of sort of preamble here before we get to our excellent speakers, I just want to note two Old Hickory speeches that were tied to two Old Hickory vetoes that are worth noting. One had to do with the Maysville Road bill that passed Congress during his presidency. The national road was being created. A lot of federal funds was going into it, but this was a section of it that was all in Kentucky. And Jackson didn't believe in the government getting into intrastate projects. And so he vetoed it. And in doing so, he wrote that the people have a right to expect, he said, a prudent system of expenditure, allowing the government to, quote again, pay the debts of the Union and authorize the reduction of every tax to as low a point as our national safety and independence will allow. But if the government had too much power and was meddling in these state matters, it could lead to what he called, quote, a corrupting influence upon the elections by giving people a sense that their votes could purchase beneficial governmental actions to make navigable their neighboring creek or river, bring commerce to their doors, and increase the value of their property. Does that sort of sound like, earmarks? He said this would be fatal to the purity of public men. And this is what he was talking about, favoritism, which is at the heart of crony capitalism. Now, on the famous Bank of the U.S. veto, he issued, which is one of my favorite presidential messages of our history. He makes clear in this message that he has nothing against the rich. Unlike some populists who are anti-rich, he was a conservative populist. He wanted to just have a level playing field, and if the rich got rich, that was fine with him. He loved to see people get rich, especially himself, because he got pretty rich early on. And the government, he even said in this veto message, has a positive responsibility to protect those people who have become wealthy from the politics of envy. He didn't use that term, but that was what he was talking about. But then he said, but when the laws undertake to add to these natural and just advantages, artificial distinctions, to grant titles, gratuities, and exclusive privileges, to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society have a right to complain. Again, we're talking about special privileges. That's really what crony capitalism is all about. And then he rose to a level of eloquence that I've always really liked when he said that the government should, quote, confine itself to equal protection, and as heaven does its rains, shower its favors alike on the high and the low, the rich and the poor. Well, I wanted to share those quotes to show that we do have a heritage in our country of anti-crony capitalism, and that's the heritage that the American conservative is pursuing. I'm delighted to introduce to you tonight our panelists, starting with on my immediate left, Boyden Gray. Everyone knows Boyden, White House counselor under George Herbert Walker Bush, ambassador to the European Union, longtime Washington lawyer of note and many accomplishments, and I might note also a board member of our parent organization of TAC. And so that's Boyden. Next to him is David M. Smick, founder of Johnson Smick International, an international financial consulting firm, founder also of the International Economy magazine, author of two widely acclaimed books, The World is Curved, which came out in, what year, Dave?
2008.
2008, and essentially predicted the Great Recession. He got a lot of attention at the time and more attention since. And last year's The Great Equalizer, a blueprint for getting out of the current economic slow growth syndrome. And Dave will talk about the sort of the world of finance with regard to crony capitalism. Timothy Carney, next to Dave, is commentary editor of the Washington Examiner. He's a visiting fellow also at AEI and has written two books, The Big Ripoff and one called Obamonomics. Now, the subtitle of Obamonomics is something I'd like to quote because it really sort of captures it all here. How Barack Obama is bankrupting you and enriching his Wall Street friends, corporate lobbyists, and union bosses. He's going to talk about regulatory abuses. And finally, we have Veronique D. Rugy, Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. She's a columnist also for Creator Syndicate. She writes regularly for Reason Magazine and blogs on economics for National Review, and she'll talk about how the tax code is used. So, Boyden, let's start with you and give us the overview.
Well, I'm not sure I'm qualified to give my colleagues an overview. I'm sure they could give me an overview, but let me try to put this in context, put some structure around it. There are two competing narratives, I think, which create a divide, which make this issue a little bit difficult to convey properly to the public. It shouldn't be difficult because crony capitalism is what has prompted this populism that we now see and led to the presidency of Donald Trump. So it shouldn't be difficult because that's what's driven our politics. But the cure for it is not agreed upon. And until the diagnosis is gotten correctly, I'm not sure that we're going to actually be able to put a dent in it. And I think the two narratives that I'll say at the outset, and parenthetically, that there are people in the Federalist Society. I'm a lawyer, and so I'm going to take a lawyer's vantage point on this. The Federalist Society doesn't like the phrase crony capitalism. because they think capitalism is just fine. It's the cronyism they don't like. So they just want to call it cronyism, which isn't a bad, but there is a ring to crony capitalism. And so I think it's here to stay. The phrase is here to stay. The two narratives are that it's money in politics, too much money, need more campaign finance reform, Congress is totally corrupted, Congress is the tool of special interests, which grant special favors, rent-seeking, and all kinds of nasty things which distort markets, lead to government symbiotic relationships between government and business and whatnot. So that's one narrative as the explanation. The other narrative is that, and this is the one that I tend to gravitate to because I'm a lawyer, it's the administrative state. It's what Congress created, these metastasizing agencies, EPA, FCC, the Fed, whatever. Take your pick, take your poison. They've gotten way out of control. And they're the ones who are combining forces with big business, and the two are symbiotically cooperating with each other. Big government likes big business because it means they don't have to make too many telephone calls to get what they want. And big business likes big government because they don't have to make too many telephone calls to get what they want, and it works out very comfortably for everybody involved, of course, except the average human being. So those are the two narratives, and the reason why they don't mesh is because the theory of the first is that Congress has been corrupted and is corrupting our government. And the premise of the second is the corruption comes from these agencies because Congress has totally abdicated its role. So either Congress is the cause or it's AWOL, and that's got to get resolved. Now, crony capitalism goes way back. It goes way back. It was, I think, Adam Smith's worst nightmare. Wealth of Nations. He worries, and indeed, you know, the first book is the theory of moral sentiments. So he thinks that moral behavior is really at the heart of all this. For him, his worst nightmare, and he didn't like Edinburgh businessmen very much, is that they would gather together, and he has this great line, you know, no two or three businessmen can get together without, you know, combining against the public interest. If you let them fix prices, that's exactly what they'll do. And so he was nervous. He thought that they would grab pieces of government, convert the government regulatory apparatus to their own benefit by creating barriers to entry, regulations that they could comply with, but their competitors couldn't, and that this would destroy the free market, or at least inhibit its advancement. And that is a correct explanation of what's happening today. That's what we have. That's basically what we have today is established incumbents grabbing pieces of the government, controlling them, these agencies, freezing out their competition, and drawing ever closer and closer together to the exclusion of competition and innovation. And there's nothing more important than competition, in my view. It creates magic when you have it. Nothing is worse and more corrosive than monopoly that is supported by the government, which monopoly has to be in order to survive. Now, what examples can I give? I would go to Dodd-Frank. I don't want to preempt anything that David's going to say about it. I would go to Dodd-Frank and note that we were looking, because we thought some of it was quite unconstitutional, and there's some rulings that have already made sort of steps in that direction. It took us a long time to get a client, however. I had people from my old firm, Willful, Cutthroat, and Nitpicker. How many people know this law firm? People from my old law firm, Willful, Cutthroat, and Picnic, if you like them, or Pickpocket if you really don't. I don't know. Depends on your point of view. They were cheering me on. Go, Greg, go! Go, Greg, go! God, this is the greatest thing you're doing. And I said, well, look, I don't need any money from you. I think we've got funding for this, but can you give me a face? We need a plaintiff. Oh, no, 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 because they couldn't afford to do it. You know, they could be any bank could be taken down in 24 hours by a bank examiner. So, who wants to pick that fight? So, we finally found this impervious, this wonderful community banker in the thriving metropolis of Big Springs, Texas. His name is Jim Purcell, wonderful guy. $270 million bank, 40 employees. It's not a giant of its genre. And he had enough courage and enough smarts to figure out that if they tried to take him down after he had sued, that this would cause real trouble, and that maybe if he sued, he would get a form of reverse insurance, that nobody would dare touch him because it would be so obvious. But within 24 hours, or less than 20, but within about 12 hours of his filing suit, we filed late one night, before midnight, electronically, and before noon the next day, his controller at the Office of the Controller of the Currency called him up and said, "Why didn't you tell us? What are you doing? Who are you talking to? Who in the media? Who's financing this? People upstairs want to know." Now, who are people upstairs? Well, in the Treasury and in the White House, people upstairs want to know. And boy, they put him through the ringer, but he handled it pretty well. And then there was a hearing, and Frank came in thinking he was going to tear him apart and started to throw questions at him at a hearing of the Financial Services Committee. And he was brilliant, and he just totally eviscerated poor Barney. And Barney had to walk out with his tail between his legs and disappear and never come back to the hearing. It was a fabulous performance. But the problem is, and what he represents is a genre, community banks, small banks that lend to small business, which is what creates most new jobs. 80% of new jobs created by small business. Most innovation comes from small business. And their lifeblood has been largely, not completely, but largely constrained or seriously constrained by these banks who can't afford to do what they're doing, and they're consolidating at a very rapid rate, and they haven't got time to do the funding that they used to do. And the big banks, who should be smaller now as a result of the big recession, are now 40% or 50% of our GDP. They're just gigantic. And I was talking to the general counsel of one of the top six, trying to find a client, and he said to me, you know, we're not really anxious to take on a frontal assault against Dodd-Frank, because if our regulators knew that we weren't going to get bailed out, they would raise our capital requirements. Now, if you understand that sentence, you understand all you need to know, and I can go home and go and leave, you know. But that, I'm glad you responded positively. Now, that sort of captures it in a nutshell. Now, what does Jamie Dimon call Dodd-Frank? Does anyone here know? He calls it his moat. And he doesn't mean moat in his eye, M-O-T-E, which is what I think it is. He thinks it's a moat around his castle. And so there you sort of have it. They're quite happy to have these marvelous barriers to entry, and Goldman Sachs is just as happy with the current situation as well. Now, this happens across the board. It's true of the monopolization sort of situation that supports healthcare, the insurance companies, the drug companies, the hospitals. There's no transparency. There's no competition. That's the way they want it. That's the way it is. Military-industrial complex. You know, you could whatever segment of the economy you want to look at, you're going to find this phenomenon now with this metastasized regulatory state. I think it's going to get. Finally, the courts are waking up to it, and at the heart of the debate is part of the discussion that was directly relevant to the nomination and confirmation of Neil Gorsuch, because he understands this probably better than anybody else on the court now, except maybe Thomas. Clarence Thomas, who's written 3 great opinions about this whole area. And the problem as they see it is too much delegation by Congress to these agencies, which allow them just to go run amok. And the key to it is a thing called, I think, a thing called the revolving door, where it's not the money coming in at the front end, it's what happens at the back end when the regulators, looking to feather their nest, lay off and give favors to the people that they want to hire them. And this is called the revolving door, and of course it's very characteristic of the banking industry. Goldman Sachs is known in some circles, I hope there's nobody here from Goldman Sachs, but they're not a client, and I don't think they ever will be. They're known affectionately as government Sachs. And this is
But at least with a Republican now, Goldman Sachs not involved in the government.
not involved. No, we got rid of it. I mean, we beat Hillary, and that was supposed to be Goldman Sachs. But look at where that's amazing. No, but this is what we're caught with, and there is a theory, well understood academic theory for this. It's called public choice theory, and it has to do with the revolving door, with the capture of these agencies by the people they're supposed to be regulating, and this is the process that leads to what I think is the heart of crony capitalism. And so it goes back to Adam Smith. It has great academic underpinnings for it. It's a well-understood discipline. It's a well-understood phenomenon for those of us who practice in this arena as lawyers. So we understand it very, very well. How do we explain it to the public when you have this competing vision that it's money coming into the system, the campaign finance? And all I can say is the succession of campaign finance laws have really almost bankrupted me. In the beginning, before they had campaign finance, there really were limits on how much I could give, and I could happily say to some begging congressman with his tin cup out, I'm sorry, sir, but I'm maxed out. Today, there's no way to say you're maxed out. I mean, there's just no limit at all. So I do think there's a problem with campaign finance, but I don't think it's at the heart of it, and we've got to resolve this difference as to what really is the cause before I think we can handle the answer to it.
Thank you. Thank you, Boyden. Over to Mr. Smick.
Boyden, that was excellent. Because it's too easy to blame the Supreme Court decision for crony capitalism. This is a mindset that's much larger that's taken over. I was also struck by, when Congress writes legislation now, they don't get to the rules. And it was interesting how many years it took. 4 years later, rules relating to the SEC in Dodd-Frank, only 40% had been completed. So the sense of uncertainty, but also the sense that as long as the rules aren't quite wrapped up, the campaign funds flow, because every institution being regulated feels, ooh, we've got to influence the rules. But my larger point in this is it has to do with another issue, economic growth and the lack of economic growth. And if you look at really beginning in the year 2000, from the George W. Bush administration, if you eliminate elements that are kind of tied into the bubble economy that were not sustainable, Bush's economy grew at 1%. This is according to Niall Ferguson, his analysis. Of course, President Obama's economy grew at not much more than that. So you had growth rates less than half the historic average. And if you go back in American history, since the country was founded in 1789, you had, since then up until the year 2000, you had a 3.7% average annual growth rate. And now we're growing at less than half. And if you go back and you say, what if the economy were growing, if the American economy had grown by the growth rate that we've experienced under presidents, I'm trying to be bipartisan here, under Presidents Bush and Obama, less than half the historic average. Today, America would have the per capita income slightly less than Papua New Guinea. I mean, we would not be the strongest economy in the world. So you look and you say, what is it that is holding the economy back? And there are a lot of things, but one of the elements that I find very intriguing is the serious decline in startups, and which has fed into a lack of labor mobility. And it certainly is one of the key elements for that's led to this lower economic growth. Now, if you were, we've always been the country of startups. I mean, if you look back to the year 1975 up until the present, there are dozens, 4 dozen companies in America, startups that began in garages and basements and whatever, and they went on to make it to the big time. This includes Apple, Oracle, all these companies and they're not just tech companies. Now you ask yourself, Europe during this period, how many startups in Europe went on to the big time? 1. We had more than 4 dozen. They had a energy renewal company in Norway. And so we've been the nation of startups. It's been our secret weapon because it revitalizes our economy. We've always had an understanding that economic dynamism comes from the bottom up, not the top down. Even though the elites are fascinated with top-down control, we've always known that there's kind of an evolutionary or an entrepreneurial factor, a constant process of this crazy Americans striking out on their own. I mean, there's something in our DNA that makes us want to reach out and start companies and follow our dreams and our ideas. And we're daring. It's something in who we are. And but what you're seeing in the last decade and a half is a real fall off in that approach. And I asked, to what extent are people holding back? People who used to, leave companies, borrow from family and friends, start up these firms, and knowing that most of them are going to fail, but some of them will make the big time. What's holding back? And one thesis in my book, my second book, is Crony Capitalism, or however you want to call it. But there's a feeling, people sense, the system is rigged. It's too hard to get ahead. They look at even, the leaders of technology. You look at Facebook and Apple and these firms that you would think that came out of nowhere, were the embodiments of the entrepreneurial process in America. And they're spending more on lawyers and accountants and buyout specialists, anything to keep down competition, than they do on new product development, new research. And so my argument is that economic growth is being affected by this collapse in what I call the startup mentality. People say it's too risky. I'll be shut down. They will manipulate the antitrust laws or manipulate the regulations. I'll be on the losing end. And which brings us to the issue with, you would ask me to talk about. And they look and say, if I mortgage my home and I borrowed from family and friends and I'm crazy, but I'm crazy like a fox, and I'm gonna make this happen, and I'm successful, sustaining that business under the current financial arrangement is much more difficult today than it was 20 years ago. I mean, the financial system, Boyden had it exactly right. We have, since the financial crisis, we've gone, the banking sector is now, which was the top 12 banks in America were 45 to 50% of American bank capital, and now they're 80%. It's been a massive consolidation of bank capital, and Jamie Dimon you may like the moat, but what Dodd-Frank has done is it created 12 zombie banks, and including J.P. Morgan. Maybe they're the least zombie-like. But these are not risk-taking, daring financial centers. These are basically zombies. They're like the town water company or the town electrical company. And the sad thing is that when you know, America always had this multi-layered financial system that was able to finance entrepreneurial risk. And now we have the Big 12, and then below them, the regional banks, community banks, particularly the regionals, the workhorses of the small business, have been decimated. 500 regional banks lost. They've been decimated in part by Dodd-Frank, but also in part by a Federal Reserve that has catered to the big. And that's why I go back to this mindset. We have a mindset that's dangerous today because we favor the large. We're in love with large institutions. Part of it in finance is that they have systemic risk. So you wave the flag of, you know, we have systemic risk. What do they get? They get special treatment. Now, after the financial crisis, and I don't want to get into a big discussion about that, unless somebody later on wants to talk about it, how it came about. But what you saw was the Federal Reserve drop rates to 0%, and or near 0%, and it produced a massive transfer of wealth from Main Street to Wall Street. But it was done because it was a yield curve play. It was for the large banks. It allowed the banks to borrow by setting rates so low. I mean, here you have the American banking system on its back. Its balance sheets have collapsed. If you set the interest rate at 0 or near 0, and you allow not just the money center banks, but you allow firms like Goldman and others access to the Fed's discount window, they can borrow for next to nothing on the short end. Then on the long end, they take advantage of that spread. And that's a long-term policy for repairing their balance sheets.
And they can't lose, right?
Oh, so no, it's what you do when you're afraid that these banks are going to collapse and present systemic risk. And that's really what's happened in the last 8 years. You've had this, you know, in the David versus Goliath confrontation, Goliath always wins. You know, the big guys always seem to carry the day, and particularly in the financial sector. I mean, now you can argue for good reason because, you know, our whole economy would collapse and all the rest, but you know, you have it really is quite amazing. It's also amazing that so much of the wealth created since the financial crisis has come from the equity market, and you have not seen the big increases in wages, and that has, as we're experiencing, presented a host of political problems that may be intractable at this point. But I do think you've got a financial sector in which the banks and the financial institutions that in the past were so key to financing. They didn't finance startups because that's too dangerous, but they were kind of in that middle process of helping the successful ones sustain themselves and rise. That's vanished, and I'm sure many of you have talked to bankers. They say they're terrified of the regulators at this point. Even on a mortgage, it's very, very difficult. Imagine you're trying to get what one startup guy told me was, he said, you know, I left, it was a big Fortune 500 company, and he started this company, and it did really well. He had everything invested in this, every penny he owned, and he said, so he goes to this bank. This is relatively recently, and they said, well, we'd like 3 years worth of collateral, and we want to see 10 years of experience running a small business. I said, what do you mean? I worked at Fortune, you know, this has been in operation for 3 years. How can I show that? So it's a catch-22. It was kind of like, you go away, leave us, and it's really heartbreaking when you see that. By the way, I'll just end real quickly with this. friend of mine was in the pretty high up in the Obama administration. It was very early on. They had just gotten elected. And this guy said he was in a meeting with the, and it was high level with the president, and but you had the top economic advisors in this meeting. And so you had Rahm Emanuel, the chief of staff, and then David Axelrod. And then also in the meeting were Tim Geithner, the Treasury Secretary, and then Larry Summers. So they got my friend said, then, you know, in the back row, there he was, along with some others. But he said that Summers and Geithner were a little late arriving at the meeting. And when they walked in, the Chicago advisors to President Obama, Axelrod and Rahm Emanuel, said, "Oh, look who's arrived. It's the Davos twins." And one of the two, I don't want to say which one, stood there and responded, "Yeah, we're doing great. How's Tammany Hall?" But it is a, when my friend told me that story, I said, well, you know, isn't that now the pressure, any new administration? It's the pressures of globalization and the pressures of the Tammany Hall mindset. Send your man to Washington and get us a deal and squash the competition in the process. And that's kind of what we're facing in the 21st century.
That is it. That is it. I've asked Tim Carney to talk a little bit about the regulatory side. So, Tim, take it away.
Thank you. The regulation when the light bulbs, the reason that you can't buy normal light bulbs anymore is because of a law that was co-sponsored by a Republican congressman and signed by a Republican president in 2007. And it set these thresholds for for how energy efficient your light bulbs needed to be. The chairman of the Republican co-sponsor was Fred Upton, who then rose to be chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee. But as he was rising to that level, a lot of Tea Partier types said, why should we put the co-sponsor of the light bulb law in charge of the Energy and Commerce Committee? And he said, okay, I recant, I shouldn't have supported the light bulb law. A friend of mine, a journalist, ran into him and said, okay, but let me ask you, why did you support it in the first place? And he said, well, you know me. I don't like regulation. But the industry said it was okay, so I figured what was the problem with it. General Electric supported the law outlawing the traditional light bulb. Why? They had a profit margin of approximately a penny. It cost them 24 cents to make a light bulb, and they sold it for a quarter, more or less. Now that, of course, is the beauty of free enterprise, right? Free enterprise is not about massive profits. It's about profit margins approaching zero. And so GE tried, oh, we're going to make fancier light bulbs, and then somebody else would come in and undercut them. GE actually got to the point where for ordinary consumer light bulbs, the stuff that you guys buy, they were a majority of the market. And the rest of the market was almost all just Sylvania and Philips. So 3 people controlled the market. 1 company controlled the majority. They should have been having massive profits, right? No, but just the competition of the 3 of them and the threat of a new entrant coming in kept the profit margins down near zero. So after trying, oh, we're going to have fancier bulbs that are more energy efficient, you'll save them, they'll last longer, people didn't want to buy them. So what did they do? They started lobbying government. And they effectively lobbied, and they passed through the light bulb law. And so GE, by using regulation, became the sort of Marxist caricature of capitalism, right? Big business selling you something more expensive that you don't want to buy. Oh, and by the way, they laid off their workers in Winchester, Virginia so that they could sell the compact fluorescents that were made in China. This is like Bernie Sanders' account of what capitalism is, and GE brought that about by lobbying for this light bulb regulation. I could probably tell a story like this about almost every industry in the country. Sometimes it's really big guys, sometimes it's smaller guys, but the story is that regulation kills competition and enriches the politically connected. And every time you see a proposed regulation, you should ask yourself, who will get rich if this regulation goes into effect? Because 99% of the Washington press corps is going to ask, oh, well, this regulation is targeting industry X. Let's see how much industry X is spending to lobby against it. Fine, that's a good story, and fine. Leave to me at the Washington Examiner the other story, which is, for instance, there was a big push, started to get some steam for a while in Congress about barring or regulating high fructose corn syrup. And it was being pushed by Citizens for Health. Now, this didn't get very far, but it's a great little microcosm of the story. So I just got on the phone and I called Citizens for Health and I said, are you guys funded by the sugar industry? And they said, yes, we are. Why do you ask? Are they funding your campaign against the high fructose corn syrup? No, but they brought to our attention why this should be a priority, and we think high fructose corn syrup is unhealthy. Do you think sugar is healthy? Oh no, sugar is not healthy either, but high fructose corn syrup is very unhealthy. That just drove home to me. Every time somebody is trying to pass a regulation, if the regulation gets anywhere, it's because somebody else stands to benefit from it. I remember reading you know, those different Wall Street firms put out those analyses of here's what you should buy, and I'm not one of those guys who buys individual stocks. I'm not smart enough. I'm sure there are lots of you people in this room. I just buy, you know, a mutual fund. And by the way, I'll talk about mutual funds in a second. But so it says, so H&R Block is poised to benefit from this new policy. So I click through and see what it is. Not because I'm going to buy H&R Block, but because I said, I bet you anything, I know what this is going to be. Sure enough, the Obama's IRS had proposed regulations on tax preparers that would effectively outlaw a mom and pop tax preparer, somebody who's a stay-at-home mom or works a full-time job but then puts in a second job from, you know, February 1st through April 15th by imposing all these regulations on schooling, on fees, on all this stuff you had to do. The IRS official who had crafted these rules was the former CEO of H&R Block. This clearly violated Obama's rules on political appointees, but he made this guy not be a political appointee, but be a career IRS hire. His career lasted a year and a half, just long enough to write the rules. IRS and Jackson Hewitt supported it, and it was illegal because the IRS doesn't have the authority to just pass these regulations out of nowhere. They defended it, and in their court case, they said, this obviously is not an onerous regulation if even the biggest members of the industry support it. So the whole picture starts to become clearer now, right? Regulation adds to overhead. Overhead is fixed costs, costs that don't necessarily vary per unit of production. And so regulation creates massive barriers to entry. So if you are General Electric making a penny on a light bulb, or if you're a tax preparer trying to, you know, figure out where to get efficiencies, better than trying to figure out how to do your job better, easier than trying to figure out how to do your job better, is to erect barriers to entry. And the single best way to erect barriers to entry is to lobby for regulation. But it's not just that. Sometimes regulations just create a demand for a product that otherwise doesn't have demand. So ethanol has a mandate. Health insurance these days has a mandate. My favorite one, though, is a regulation that my favorite one I learned about recently. On your mutual funds, you might get those prospectuses in the mail unless you go ahead and you opt out. Now, the prospectus, again, maybe somebody in this room has once read their prospectus from a mutual fund. It goes straight into my garbage. The only time it doesn't is when it's summer and it's grilling season and you need the paper to start up the charcoal, okay? So I'm not going to say it has no value, because you shouldn't do that with newspapers, because you should read newspapers is what you should do with newspapers. The federal government wanted to make it so that you could, the mutual fund company could decide that the default was going to be you don't get the paper prospectus. But they were still going to require these mutual fund companies to say, okay, you can opt into it. And they'll send you one letter and say, do you want to opt in? And they'll send you another letter. And they would make it really easy to opt in, was a promise from the mutual fund companies. Just take away from us the mandate that we send these people stuff until they actively opt out. They figured they'd save a lot of money on paper. this regulation was cruising through the Obama administration until it met opposition. Now, I might misremember the name of the public interest group. I think it was Americans for Paper Options. Americans for Paper Options was obviously the front group for the paper mills. And they literally wanted to have a regulation mandate the slaughter of trees. I love trees. And they were mandating the waste of paper. It's the best sort of microcosm of Washington. Waste, literal waste of labor, of resources, of trees being mandated in order to profit one company. Environmental regulations everywhere you look. You can find Enron supported the U.S. ratification of the Kyoto Protocol. General Electric again. Goldman Sachs gets called Government Sachs. General Electric should get called Government Electric. And again, I could rattle off almost any industry. Tobacco, Philip Morris supported the, I'll quickly tell the tobacco thing. Philip Morris, for years, supported federal regulation of tobacco. They called it, the smaller cigarette companies called it the Marlboro Monopoly Act, was what they called it. And of course, when Obama signed the bill in the Rose Garden, he said, "We have finally stood up to big tobacco." At that moment, I logged on to altria.com. We applaud President Obama for signing this bill. So why? And I think I want to talk about this because I think it gives some good examples. One, regulations add barriers to entry. They keep out smaller competition. If you're 50% of the market, like Philip Morris was, everybody's obviously smaller competition. Two, they were basically outlawing cigarette advertisements there. So over the long run, U.S. smoking has dropped down, maybe partly because of this bill, but the market share of Philip Morris has not gone down because if you already have a majority, cigarette advertisement for the most part is about winning somebody from one brand to another. So you freeze in place that market share. But then after a few months, as they're implementing the law, so I think we should talk about the question of is it the administrative state or Congress, because I think it's both. But as they're implementing the law, I went and I checked in the regulatory comments. And one I found was from some company. It was called something like Smoking Joe's. And this, it was this farmer who sold, or a guy who lived next door to these farms and sold just these local, they were almost like organic cigarettes or whatever, and apparently they're great. Now, I don't smoke, but he said, look, we give out free samples to like the guys who run the gas stations so they can see how great they are. You would outlaw free samples, and we don't have a marketing budget, and so this is really tough for us to get out on shelves if we're giving out free samples. Can you come up with another regulatory framework to make sure that we're not just trying to hook 15-year-olds on cigarettes, but not getting in the way of our only marketing technique? So that was a really interesting thing I had never thought about. I then went over and I read Philip Morris's lobbying comment. I don't even remember the substance, but it was not this regulation is overly burdensome. It was nitpicking on how things would work here and there. And then I got to the bottom, and I saw that the lawyer who signed it was literally a former FDA commissioner. So it's the regulatory capture, the revolving door. I absolutely agree the revolving door is a problem because the revolving door provides incentives for the people in government to regulate business more so as to maximize their value when they leave government, and it makes this sort of regulatory robbery a much more profitable thing because if you are able to hire Barney Frank's former chief of staff, or you're able to hire the guys who wrote Obamacare, or you're able to hire a former FDA commissioner, then you can deal with the regulations. Not just because of the higher overhead and your economies of scale, but because it's now you are part of the inside game. Regulation is, I think, the beating heart of crony capitalism, and regulation increases government's role in the economy, and big government is a home game for the big guys and the politically well-connected. And every time you see government increasing, you have to look for who's going to get rich off of that, and you'll probably find their fingerprints on it.
No doubt. Very good. Vero, I've asked Vero to talk about the tax code and how that gets loaded up. I call it the loading the code.
Yeah. The advantage of going last is that you can actually think of things to say that the other panelists have said, so to comment on them. The bad thing about it is you forget what they've said. But one of the things that I do remember is like the conversation about the names, about whether crony capitalism or cronyism is like, I always go back and forth on this debate, because I actually do think that cronyism is the biggest threat to capitalism, and it takes two to tango, right? I mean, it's like it takes capitalists to get in bed with the government to get crony capitalism or cronyism. That being said, right, if you the solution is to get rid of the ability of government to hand out favors to the capitalists to put an end to this. So I guess maybe cronyism is better. The other thing is, like when Tim was talking about the H&R Block, I thought, oh, that's a nice transition to what I'm going to say, because one of the reasons that the IRS used to go after tax preparer is that there's a very high improper payment rate for the earned income tax credit. Which has it's nothing compared to fraud and improper payment in healthcare. It's nothing like that in terms of dollar amount, but in terms of percentage, it's like sometimes it's 25% of the payment that the program makes, right? And it's like it's handing out money through the tax code. And so the IRS said, oh, you know, it's who is supposed to administer the program said, oh, you know, it's not us, it's all these, you know, questionable tax preparers, and then I guess they got an idea to H&R Blocks, and here we are, right? And thankfully they were defeated now. So yeah, the tax code is a hot mess. I mean, we know this. There are many reasons why that is. None of them are good, right? But I think one of the biggest one is because interest groups, lobbyists in the government make deals together and agree to carve the tax code through the use of tax credit, tax exemption, preferential rate, deduction, and various loopholes, right? And obviously that works great for lobbyists and interest groups who get this backdoor industrial policy that distort the economy in their favors, and it works great for politicians who get, you know, rewarded for this handing out of a government-granted privilege. But it doesn't work that great for us, for the economy and for Americans. I mean, it does complicate the tax code quite extensively. Now, there are two sides, right, of all these exemptions and tax credit. There's an individual side and there's a corporate side. And so today we'll talk about the corporate side. The corporate side is actually small compared to the overall amount of deduction and tax expenditures, as the government likes to call it. I mean, it's the terms I really don't like. But it's like roughly $300 million out of a $1.2 trillion. So it's pretty small, but it's not nothing, right? And so before I start digging into those cronyism in the tax code, I want to actually go very briefly on what are the good principles of tax reforms, right? Or like our tax code should be broad-based, low rate, no double taxation of savings and investment, fairness, transparency, and stability. These are, like, at least in my opinion, and I think this is kind of widely recognized principle of good taxation. Now, if you think about it, and obviously we know what cronyism is this unhealthy marriage between the government and corporations. Now, in the tax code, if you think about it this way, all deduction, exemption, tax credit could be considered loopholes to corporations. However, what makes it very hard for us to distinguish which one are the good one or which one are the bad ones is because some of those alterations to the tax base are actually meant to fix the tax code and to get us closer to those good principles of taxation that I've mentioned. So for instance, the preferential rate on capital gains, right? I mean, it's done at the individual level, but one of the reasons why it's done is because that income is already been taxed at the corporate level, right? Also, the deferral for income earned overseas that corporations are getting, right? I mean, there's a condition, they have to keep their income abroad. The reason why they're getting this is because that income has already been taxed abroad, right? So it's like, I mean, I know the left always calls it a loophole, but the truth is like that it's, I mean, income has already been taxed one. And it's important to have a neutral tax system, but it's also extremely important to get a tax system that taxes income only once. And we're far, far from this currently. Now, there are like tax credits and deduction and that are like clearly cronyism. So the second generation biofuel producer tax credits, clearly one. There's another one, I can never remember its name, because the thing that's amazing is when you go through the list of all these tax credits, right? And it's not just like, I think, a deficiency of my memory, which I mean accounts for a lot in this, but it's just like, these are like the interest groups, it's crazy. I mean, the interest groups are super specific. Yet, you know, it's not just like the financial industry as a whole. It's like, so for instance, you have the railroad short track maintenance credit. And I'm always thinking, is there like a lobbying for like the railroad? Like it's like, I mean, and you look at all these tax credits, and they're super, super specific. So these are like clearly, they're alteration to the tax base that gets us away from a neutral system, from a broader base, and makes it, you know, and then down the road requires higher rate and creates many distortions, right? The list is very, very, very long. And it is worth, actually, for each one of us, it's like, it's pretty easy. You go in the budget and to look at it. Actually, David Burton at the Heritage Foundation just put a list of some of these deductions that's pretty interesting. I think it's incomplete, but it's a good start to look at it. So these are like clearly cronyism. It's clearly cronyism in the tax code. Tim knows that I develop obsessions, policy obsessions, where I would like, that's all I think about for a while. He and I shared an obsession of fighting the Export-Import Bank. And I guess my current obsession is the border adjustment tax. When you think about that tax reform, which is in the blueprint, the House Republican blueprint. I mean, what that change would entail, made for the argument presented as a question of neutrality and all this. It's like technically what it is it's a tax on import doubled with a subsidy of exports, right? It's like all income from exports are exempted from a tax. I will leave it up to you to think of whether that's cronyism in the tax code if implemented. I can tell you, for instance, that the people who are lobbying for it are exporters. The people who are lobbying against it are importers, right? And the exporters lobbying against it are our friends at GE, Boeing. I mean, they're the Caterpillar, or all our friends from the Export-Import Bank. Let's say, if it's not cronyism, it seriously looks like it. At the very least, it is export mercantilism, of the vein of many of the things that we have. Now, to make things even more complicated, a lot of those tax credit and exemption and corporate privileges that are granted are done through the tax extender packages. Have you heard of this? It's like they're tax extenders that are usually done for a year or two, and they're like dozens of tax credits and other tax provisions, specifically targeting industries, company, the two ones, the biofuel and the short track, the railroad short track ones, were in the tax extender package, which was not extended. But I'm like, rest assured, I'm sure they're lobbying right now, and at some point it will come back because nothing ever goes really fully away in Washington. But the thing that's kind of interesting about this thing is the fact that it's temporary, right? The fact that it actually it opens a whole other door for uncertainty, distortions, but it's extremely lucrative for politicians if you think about it, right? Because every year or every other year, right, they get to cash in on all these companies wanting to renew these tax provisions for them. Now, I should say that, again, in this whole list of provisions, some of them are in the type of trying to alleviate the double taxation of income, and others are like pure crony provisions. That being said, I think that they should be either all extended and then we can fight for them, or all terminated, because the uncertainty and the fact that they're short term like this is like add to the complexity of our tax code. Now, I'll finish with 2 points. First, there's a moral component to as always with cronyism in the tax code. I think there's something that's really immoral and unseemly about the fact that some companies, because they are well connected, get to pay fewer taxes, lower taxes than other companies. Sometimes, again, it's in the same industry. Sometimes it's neighbor firms. I mean, some tax exemptions are extremely specific and actually specifically done for one particular company. So it's extremely problematic, right? And so I think there's a real moral. I mean, if you care about justice, if you think that there should be a fairness in the tax code, you should have a problem with those the tax code being used to grant privilege to some companies. The final point I will say, as much as I'd like to get rid of all of them, to get rid of all this cronyism in the tax code, I would rather it being done in the context of fundamental tax reform. Because the silver lining of those tax exemptions is like the government doesn't get as fat as it would be otherwise. Now, it's a bad argument. It's a bad argument for them. That being said, I will stick to it because I don't want the government to have as much. So I would prefer if we got rid of all of them in the context of actually, you broaden the base and you lower the rate. And on this, I will end.
Thank you very much, Vero. Well, there's a lot of fodder for thought and for discussion, so I'd like to turn it over to all of you now. We have people back here with microphones, and so I will call on you, and wait just a moment, right here, this gentleman here. Is there someone with a microphone? Right here. Coming your way.
Augustus Alzona. I've worn many hats in the community. Family and extended family has been here in the D.C. area since 1955. We've seen presidents come and go, et cetera, et cetera. And my question is, obviously, I was a Trump supporter. I supported his campaign big time for various reasons. And am quite aware of the deep state implications and all that and what's going on politically speaking right now. So my question for each and every one of you, if you feel comfortable answering it, if you were the president right now, whom would you fire from his cabinet and who would you replace them with? Whom would you fire from his cabinet, if you feel at liberty to say, yeah. And whom would you replace them with?
The right answer, especially on this panel, is Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, I remember him in 2010 on CNBC criticizing Obama and saying, what Obama needs to understand is what the Chinese understand, is that you have these 5-year plans. So Obama talks about solar energy. The Chinese actually put their money where their mouth is, and they prop up these whole industries no matter what, and they make real national champions. Wilbur Ross is himself a crony capitalist, and he advocates crony capitalism. Obama picked him, Trump picked him because Trump has this love of exports, and this sort of cronyism, mercantilism is disastrous. Wilbur Ross is the worst member of the cabinet, and he should be replaced with nobody because the Department of Commerce should be abolished.
Yeah, Vero, yeah.
I'm in 100% agreement. The Department of Cronyism should be renamed the Department of Cronyism. Did I say that?
You said, yeah.
Whatever. See, I can't think of it outside of not being just a crony. You know, you put the census somewhere else and be done with the whole thing, and I agree.
Anybody else?
Who are you going to fire?
You're asking me?
And who would you replace him with?
I'd fire Cordray. You know, the thing about Cordray is that he is totally privileged, which means to say he has to answer to no one, absolutely no one.
It's unconstitutional.
It is unconstitutional.
Well, but I have a question for you on that. Does that protect him from these threats of capture or of undue influence?
Oh, no, of course not.
That's the Elizabeth Warren argument, is that the SEC and all these others have been captured because of congressional influence or whatever, and that these special agencies will be protected from capture.
No, of course not, because of the revolving door, which of course is still permitted, if not encouraged, with the CFPB. But my favorite story about CFPB is Cordray, who can't be fired by the president, although there's a court ruling which won't probably survive until it gets to the Supreme Court, saying the president can't fire him. He's totally beyond the purview of Congress because the money that runs his agency comes from the Fed. And the Fed is prohibited from having anything to do with the agency that it funds. And of course, Congress can't do anything. And the courts are required to accept whatever Cordray says about whatever statute that he's meddling with, which about 18 statutes that he has a right to meddle with. So he doesn't have to answer to anybody. He did go to a hearing where the question came up about the $250 million they spent on the renovation of their very expensive headquarters. And the chairman of the Financial Services Subcommittee, relevant subcommittee chairman, asked him who was in charge of this rather lavish decoration. And you know what his answer was? What does it matter to you? Now that's about the most constitutionally insolent thing I've ever heard in my, pathetic knowledge of American history. But what does it matter to you? That's where we are.
I wonder whether his all quest against payday lending. I mean, what's the industry that stands to benefit? Because unless they do like the Obamacare for the banking system, where they mandate that everyone has a bank account in a regular bank.
Payday lending, I don't know who the beneficiary is, but I do know that the trial lawyers are deeply involved, and they're the number 1 or 2 funders of the Democratic Party, and he wants to run for governor of Ohio. So I think that's the chain of...
And there's at least one firm in Georgetown that's all revolving door people from CFPB. And they say, hey, if you have to deal with the CFPB, you have to hire us.
Sir.
Yes. Since you mentioned Nobel Prize winning economist George Stigler's phrase, bureaucratic capture, why don't you talk about Stigler's advocating the antitrust laws, not so much for therapy, for breaking up bigness, Protestant moralism, but because it promotes economic efficiency. I remember Trump was criticizing or threatening Jeff Bezos with using the antitrust laws. Isn't there a good reason in terms of economic efficiency to enforce those laws?
So I am a fan of antitrust laws because my dad's an antitrust lawyer and he paid for half of my college. So thank you, Dad. They at times, though, are abused, right? They at times serve the opposite purpose, such as when there used to be 2 satellite radio channels, Sirius and XM, not XM, Sirius and XM, and they merged. But who was fighting and using the FTC to try to block their merger? It was Clear Channel. And Sirius and XM both said Clear Channel is bigger than both of us combined, so how can they object? And a former senator lobbyist, John Ashcroft, made the argument. He said, well, there's no competitor to Sirius and XM. And so, what do you mean? There's all these radio stations, including Clear Channel, which is bigger. Well, no, satellite radio is its own industry. So these two would form a total monopoly. And so terrestrial radio does not compete with Sirius XM. So why did Clear Channel pay $1 million to hire John Ashcroft to try to block this merger if they didn't see them as a competitor? And there are other examples of the antitrust laws being used. There's a Noor-Pennington doctrine, which is that conspiracies and constraint of trade don't violate antitrust laws if the government is one of the co-conspirators, basically. That the big unions, the big coal mines, the United Mine Workers and the big coal mines got together with the federal government to try to pass these regulations that help the unions and kill the smaller coal mines, and that was perfectly fine. So while I think that antitrust law is not, I don't have a total opposition to it. I'm helplessly biased because of my dad, but I do also think that like almost any government power, it's like a weapon. And ultimately, it's going to get in the hands of the more powerful people, and it's going to end up backfiring. But
I would agree. I also think the patent system it's like the cousin of this manipulation of the antitrust. The patent system I've seen the estimates of the cost in terms of what we spend on healthcare alone. It's just manipulation is extraordinary. And I think it goes back to the fundamental question of declining productivity, declining startups, companies that say, well, that patent's running out on this date, and then Shazam, it's not. It's extended. There's all kinds of cutouts. I think is very, very destructive to the risk-taking climate.
A gentleman right here, I'm going to call on you, but just a moment. I am in extremis here. You have your question. If there's another question before I get back, I'll be back shortly. Excuse myself. Boyden will call on you.
Here's the mic.
So, go ahead.
I'm sorry, he distracted me a little bit. What was the last thing you said?
Patent system.
No, but not about patents.
Antitrust laws.
No, that wasn't it. I'm sorry. Let's pass this on.
Let me just make one other comment about if you are a large company, and large companies in this kind of environment should be wary. And every CEO goes to bed, particularly every tech CEO goes to bed at night worried about some guy is in his garage figuring out the next big thing that's going to make the big company obsolete.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
So I think the big companies love the fact that the tax code is so complex, because for the little guy who's starting out, the startups and the small companies that have potential to rise up, they don't have the resources to deal with this complex tax code. And I think it's a real advantage too. And I think that's why the economy would benefit so much from not just tax cuts, but true tax reform. And it's terrifying. The larger the company is, the more resources they have, the more they're terrified of a simple tax code with a relatively simple series of forms, because it eliminates that point of advantage.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
You got, wait.
Microphone coming.
Gareth Porter, independent investigative journalist. I really enjoyed the presentations. It was really quite informative and helpful for me as an outsider, not really involved in this issue before this. But I'd like to ask. The presentations have almost all been at the level of sort of suggesting that there's fundamental principles at work here, which is obviously true. But I'd like to ask whether any of you could comment on how this problem has morphed over a period of decades, shall we say. What forces have, in fact, changed the way in which this is operated, have altered the significance of it, have altered the severity of the problem, and so primarily to provide a kind of a potential source of thinking about how to address it politically. Thank you.
I want to throw out an idea, and I want to hear Boyden's thoughts on this, because he's been here longer than I have. And I don't mean that as an insult.
Who's older?
I agree totally with Boyden that the revolving door is a fundamental problem, and that I think it's gotten worse over the years. If you were to have had people get in and do a conspiracy, and I don't think this happened, but say, we're going to change the healthcare sector and we're going to regulate the financial sector, and what we're going to do is maximize our value when we leave here. It would have been more regulations, more subsidies for potential bailouts, ambiguous regulations that would take years to implement on the level, greater interaction of business and government, but no crowding out of the private sector by government. And that's exactly what you got in Obamacare and Dodd-Frank. And I've tracked I call it the great healthcare cash out and the great Dodd-Frank cash out. There's actually sort of a sweet romantic story of this couple that were dating when they were Democratic healthcare staffers, then got married as the bill passed, cashed out, and out of their marital home, they run a lobbying firm whose clients are all the people affected by this. I think this, it could be like a great Washington Post profile, like Washingtonian even. I think that is the feedstock of the cronyism, but what I don't know enough of is whether that's getting worse than it was a generation ago.
Wow.
I think it's a lot worse. Somebody,
I agree.
go ahead, Veronique.
No, I think it's worse because the stakes are much higher. So the government's grown, because there are really two parties to this, right? It's really this unhealthy marriage between the two. But so taxes are higher, regulations are higher, everything is bigger. The stakes for these companies are bigger, and the profits and the benefits of actually escaping from all of this is higher. But also for politicians, the cash out is bigger, right? Because the more you grant privilege, the more rewarded you are. So I think it's bound to grow and grow and grow. And the thing that I find really tragic, and this is why I see it as the bigger threat to capitalism, is like actually today there are a lot of companies in which their business model includes those government-granted privilege. It is part of the business model to feed off this cronyism, and I think that wasn't the case. I don't know if it's 20 years ago, 30. I mean, cronyism always existed, but at this level where it's like completely part of the makeup of a company, I think it's pretty significant.
But don't you
I
think
also
that
think that the economy today is a lot more complex.
Yeah.
It's a global economy. It wasn't that way 30 years ago, the way it is now. Also, the exponential nature of technological change has made just this large, kind of complex, swiftly changing thing. I mean, you look at the Homestead Act passed in 1862, 2 pages. Federal Reserve legislation in 1913, 13 pages. You know, I'm not the rules, just Dodd-Frank, 2,300 pages. And then the rules much greater than that because of the complex nature. You don't just have a couple banks. It's a very, very complex thing, and it's why I wouldn't say it's a moral issue as much as it is just when it's that complex, people are given opportunities. These companies see opportunities in taking advantage of the complexity through the regulatory side.
But don't you think the government makes it that much more complex? I mean, you mentioned Dodd-Frank. Glass-Steagall, if I remember correctly, was 32 pages, and it was very simple. The government doesn't have to make it that complex. It basically, if you do this, you can't do that. If you do that, you can't do this. It was very simple. It was easy to regulate. But now these laws are so complex for a reason, because it enhances the deep state regulatory class that subsists on this.
Well, and also it's a reason because it is a more complex economy too, as well. So they're
But Bob's right. I mean, if you try to figure out an EPA regulatory set of regulations covering whatever it is, you really it's impossible to do without having a first-class mathematician or a Phi Beta Kappa in physics, because they will put things in such complex terms that nobody can understand it. And so it's all designed for the same thing. But let me put some historical context, because you asked the question, where did this come from? In some ways, as I said, going back to Adam Smith, a lot of these problems
So you have been around for a while.
I've been around. Adam Smith was a friend of mine. And these problems are not new. He knew all about it, and it ends up, a lot of his thinking ends up in the Constitution. The notion of separation of powers, competition against ambition. The notion was that competition between the three branches would keep each of the three branches in check. That was you know, in a way, it's right out of Adam Smith. And so there are all these links that you know, so it's in our Constitution is really, Oliver Wendell Holmes said, and the famous case of Lochner, this is all part of the progressive era launched by, some people think the worst president we ever had, Woodrow Wilson, launched by him and taken from the German learning about, you know, experts. We're going to have experts running things, and, you know, the public can't be trusted. And so we have this fallout of these regulatory agencies going crazy and passing laws about, and then some of the laws made sense about hours of work for children and women. And Oliver Wendell Holmes, in a famous dissent in Lochner, says the U.S. Constitution does not embody any economic principle. And this is just totally wrong. And by the end of his career in a free speech case, he said the best test, the way you test an idea is its ability to win in the marketplace of ideas. So he had been totally converted over the course of his career on the Supreme Court into the notion that the Constitution was a free market icon. Well, this is what the progressives, Woodrow Wilson, wanted to destroy. He, taking all this learning from the Germans, he did his best to destroy it, and thank God he was succeeded by Calvin Coolidge, who dismantled much of what the damage he had wrought. But we get into the Great Depression, and in comes Roosevelt, who revives all of this, and we have just an explosion of regulatory agencies, and it continues, and Nixon makes it worse. But it grows and grows and grows. And Reagan then comes in, and he puts sort of a halt to it. He can't dismantle what's already been done, but he shuts down any future regulation for 12 years. And the economy went into one of the greatest growth spurts in its history, right? At 20, 30 years, the greatest growth since the 1880s. But then along comes, I hate to say this, 43 who didn't really have his mind on the ball because he was worried about some other things, understandably, I guess. And then along comes Obama, who never met a regulation he didn't like, and the regulatory state, administrative state, explodes again over the last 8 years. And that's what we're facing now, is this metastasis of these regulatory agencies. And if you don't have big government, you're not going to get big business. I mean, monopolies survive, talking about the antitrust law, only because of support from the government. I just don't think monopolies have a natural tendency to survive. Somebody comes along and invents a better light bulb. But if the government is said, frozen life where it is for incumbents, we do have monopolization. So my cure, I mean, my cure, but the cure that I represent, the cure that I'm part of, is that you don't deconstruct. I mean, I'm not sure I can quite go as far as the White House does to say we're going to deconstruct the administrative state, because you really can't destroy it all. But you certainly can stop it in its tracks, and I think that's the best thing that Trump has done, combined with his confirmation of his putting Gorsuch on the court, because he understands this problem. And let me give you one small example of how the problem works. There's a case called Chevron. How many people in this? Probably lawyers over there. But it's called Chevron Deference. So if you're in a regulatory fight, you're trying to appeal under the laws, you're trying to challenge something that a regulatory agency has done to you by favoring X over Y, and you happen to be Y, and you're saying, hey, it's not a fair fight, because the law requires the courts to defer to one side of the case, the government. And if the government is doing this for the benefit of some revolving door, clientele, which is hidden, you never really know on the surface of the thing who actually it is, but you can always scratch. There's always a winner and a loser. Just scratch a little bit and you'll find out. So this is the government saying the incumbent wins. It just wins. If you're an innovator and you're challenging the big guy, you lose, because the courts are required to go with the big guy. Now that's outrageous. Now that's under challenge. That's what the Gorsuch nomination was all about. That's what Thomas is all about. And you'll see this fight take place in the courts over the next, because in the short run, the only way to fix this, in the opinion of a lot of us, is the courts have to step in and blow the whistle and cut out this preference for the crony capitalists. They got to cut out the preference. And if the courts will enforce a level playing field, and we stop the regulatory state from, ever increasing, then I think we can get back on an even keel again. But that's a lot easier said than done.
You talk about the Reagan era and the predictability, at least, and you look at the situation today. Today, our economy is suffering from the lack of productivity gains, assuming productivity is being measured accurately. And that's in large part because of decline in investment. But how can you invest in a climate in which the regulatory future is so unclear? And I think that was one of the beauties of the Reagan era, where you kind of, from the start, you had a understanding that for at least the next 8 years, you were going to see a relatively benign regulatory, but more importantly, a predictable regulatory climate. So you could take the risk of investing in without kind of wondering, what kind of surprise could I see coming from the crony capitalist side. Now, that doesn't mean that era was perfect, but I agree with you. It's when you match that era, and I would throw even the offshoot of the Clinton era, I think, because Clinton was not...
he was not a big regulator.
He was not a regulator because he was a governor. And
he was a southerner. He was a southerner.
Exactly. And you look at the growth rates of that era, and you compare it to the growth rates, GDP growth rates of the George W. Bush, Obama era. Clinton had 4.9% growth rates. Reagan had Clinton had 3.9. Reagan had, from 82 on, growth rates above 40, above 4%. And there were a number of reasons, but one was a relatively benign regulatory climate where there was no fear of this sudden abrupt surprise because the company you invested in has suddenly had a huge disadvantage because the regulatory game was being played and they're on the losing end.
And can I add something? Just like there's something that is often we lose sight of is like the government can be at the same time pro-cronies and anti-growth. I mean, obviously cronyism, in my opinion, hinder growth, but not in this way. So for instance, we were talking about the lack of investment. Like you had Obama, who was very happy to grow the regulatory states for the sake of Wall Street and the insurance companies and all this, while at the same time punishing the business community and hindering investment in the form of higher taxes on capital, right? And all this actually leads to lower productivity because if you have less investment and investment and the investment in capital actually make labor more productive and so on and so forth. But you have those two things. It's not just one is a crony, but often you have this, on the one hand they give, on the other hand they punish corporations. So it's never a straightforward story.
And it's a vicious circle. The subsidies justify more regulation, subsidize, which justifies more subsidies, and it brings power into Washington. And if you were to look at it from sort of a Wilsonian view of oh, we need the experts to tell the companies what to do. This was the whole attitude during World War I, was the CEOs and the business executives were all saying, well, this is great because we're getting rid of, with this War Industries Board, where all the companies are working together for the war, we should keep this going afterwards. Because what have we done? We've gotten rid of the destructive redundancy and the throat cutting. What is redundancy and throat cutting? It's competition. These people thought they were smarter than the competition. There's a less charitable way to interpret it is that these businessmen, these government people want more power, either because they love the power or the power transfers into money. But Boyden made the thing about there's fewer phone calls to make. Wasn't that a Henry Kissinger thing that he said, what's the phone number for Europe? He wanted there to be a quicker way to do that sort of diplomacy. Now there is, and it's Angela Merkel's phone number. But not the first time you're German, never mind. But I had this experience, and I got to tell, this personal experience, the closest I ever came to being a regulator. DC has these things called advisory neighborhood councils. And I was on a volunteer subcommittee of it called the Alcohol Beverage Licensing Council. I thought that there were two different things, that there's alcohol beverages and licensing, but apparently they didn't serve us at these meetings. But so my job was to try to sort of tear down the rules that went in as bars tried to come into H Street Northeast, which had been bombed out by the '68 riots, is now certainly up and coming. But the one guy opened a martini bar. And then another guy who owned a couple bars came in and opened 6 bars. And there were 2 Green Party members. Again, this is a volunteer committee, but it's DC. So there's 2 Green Party members. And afterwards they're talking and saying, I'm kind of concerned about 6 of the 7 bars being owned by one guy. And I'm trying to make an argument, well, no, they're still going to, it's still good. There's still going to be competition. He's got these ownerships right. And the other person says, no, this is great. Now, if we want to impose some sort of rule on them, there's only one guy we have to call. And they high five, and it's great. Monopoly and consolidation, and this is explicitly part of the argument behind Obamacare, is that fewer businesses, fewer hospitals means bigger margins, but also just more consolidation there is, the more power these politicians have.
Can I ask the panel a question? We have the Republican Party and the Trump administration trying to reform or trying to replace Obamacare. And it's not my field of healthcare, but my instinct is there's a medical cartel that controls prices. And Paul Ryan's a very good friend of mine. I've told Paul this. I think you're wasting your time. I think Republicans they've got to crush the cartel. They're not going to. There is no market to establish. tell me I'm wrong, but I feel a little bit like there's going to be this big effort, and they're not going to see the kind of results they want because the cartel is so powerful.
Well, think about competition. I think Obama himself proposed this during the campaign, to have insurance companies allowed to compete across state lines. And the reason why they don't is because they got a law passed, after the war, I think, or just before the war, which prohibits interstate competition between insurance companies. Well, of course you're going to have nothing but monopolization. It's outrageous. But hospitals don't compete. You can't. If you're good at this, I'm not. But if you're good, you can look up and you can get the lowest hotel rate, or you can get the best car loan, or you can get da-da-da-da-da. But if you want to find out whether it's cheaper to have your hip replaced, I hate to use the word hip because that's Scalise. If you want to have a tooth removed, which is the cheapest dentist? There's no way to find out.
Interestingly, you can totally do that with boob jobs.
Because they're not covered by insurance.
Exactly, because they're not covered by insurance. And actually, I will say, maybe I'm the odd person on the panel to think that actually the fact that Republicans have been so obsessed about providing insurance as opposed to good health care is actually the best coup of the insurance industry ever. Because you have the Republicans for years now trying to pretend that we can find some sort of market solution to providing health care to all at a low price. But what is health care? What is health insurance? First, it's a third-party payer. It's not it's all the distortions. Whether the third party is the government or insurance, you're going to get a whole sorts of distortions, higher demand, and all of that stuff, and you don't get, the result is not necessarily actually good healthcare, and certainly healthcare, the way to go about healthcare is to free the supply of healthcare from all the cronyism, whether it's in the medical profession, hospital, insurance, everywhere it is. And I think this is the way to go. It's certainly not the insurance.
And doctors push regulations that keep nurse practitioners from competing with them. Drug industry. The patents and the intellectual property in the drug industry is built basically into the Constitution. But does it go just far enough to guarantee innovation, or does it go further to create rent seeking? Just the laws that preference employer-based health insurance decrease the competition in shopping for insurance, because I don't shop for insurance. Somebody shops for the company, and actually, I think every company I've ever been at, that person was a HR director who's always a woman who was always on her husband's health insurance, so she was never even on ours. So I think it's the industry that has the least competition for a variety of reasons, and there is something of a cartel, and I think one of the reasons you're not going to get good healthcare reform from Republicans is because they still think, just like Fred Upton did about the light bulbs, that where you turn for good wisdom on market-based healthcare reform is going to be industry, and the industry is going to steer them into the wrong.
Let me turn to the audience for further questions. Right here, ma'am. Yes.
Hi, Netra Halprin with Peace Films. I wanted to ask, anybody want to talk about marijuana? It was, it was demonized, and the reasons I've heard is, one, the aspirin industry benefited from it. The hemp was killed, so the paper industry benefited, and now, of course, the prison industrial complex is really benefiting. So it's kind of a very complex, multifaceted issue.
I've never thought about it this way, but it's a great story.
Yeah, no, I've never dug into those. Alcohol, I have seen alcohol industry lobbying against marijuana legalization, which, again, I think I prefer alcohol as my drug, but on a broad social level, there's good arguments that alcohol is more damaging than marijuana. And in Missouri, there have been lawyers who full-time have worked pocketing alcohol industry money and running anti-marijuana campaigns. And it's hard to imagine. Sometimes you see these guys pushing for regulations, and you can see either they're saying, well, we're treated unfairly and we don't want these guys getting a free pass. So sometimes the restaurants say, we're over-regulated, that's why you need more regulations on the food trucks. Of course, the right answer is let's deregulate everybody. Sometimes they're saying, well, actually, no, we keep the proper standard and we don't, and it's immoral to let anybody drop below us, and so we want this proper standard. That has the form of a legitimate argument. But when it's alcohol trying to lobby to keep out marijuana, it's hard for me to see how that has a form of a...
But what you said is interesting. I guess it could be, I never thought about it, but it could be the next bootleg and Baptist.
Yeah.
Baptist marriage, like, you know, where you'd have this alliance between the industry and the bootlegger and the purist, like they say. So I'll look into this.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Hi. When Boyden was laying out the lay of the land, he said that there was two different sides of it, and I do think there are two different sides of it. I think people on the left, and even the extreme left, would actually agree with what we're talking about now. So I had a sort of a constructive suggestion, maybe you want to take it, and it's not original. But if there was, when you're putting up these articles, if there is a way for you to share, I don't know if it's even possible, but an article written by this side into the Nation, and let's say, and the Nation writes one, which is down over here. Because if we are going to get moving on this, if two sides are resistant, we're never, ever going to move. So if both people try to push this little stone, we just might be able to do it.
And there's an example of it working, right? Not in undoing something that exists, because that almost never happens. I mean, Vera and I spent 12 years of our life trying to kill a government agency, and we got it dead for about 5 months, and then it came back to life. But it's zombie-ish at the moment. But in blocking a new proposal, it's the Stop Online Privacy Act. Do you guys remember SOPA? It was this corporatist thing, and what you had was, again, the libertarians and the left agreed. But also, it was important that it was elites of the libertarians and the lefts that agreed, who had control over, like Google, for instance, was actually on the good side on this against, I think, AT&T. I don't remember who the pro-regulation people was. And in that case, they shot down a bill by a left-right alliance. Similarly with, to some extent, food trucks and Uber have overcome these things, again, because the liberal elites and like the young, like millennial people who are hyperactive politically on the libertarian side have done it and agreed. But in general, I think the far left, far right things just lose because they don't have the money that the centrists all have, because they're not the ones cashing out with all the lobbies feeding into it. So we have had left-right alliances work, but we're always starting off as way behind. But also there's a problem of, on the right, I think we've solved the problem. Not solved it, but addressed it. When I wrote my first book on this in '06, I had people coming up to me and saying, stop talking about cronyism because you're attacking business and thus giving fodder to the left. And I had people on the right say, you just shouldn't talk about this. That, I think, has mostly gone away. On the left, though, there's a bit of a revamp. There was an article in Salon or The Nation or Slate or something saying, Texas is about to become an even more dangerous state. Now, their idea is that in Texas, everybody's constantly getting shot by, like, people, you know. Yeah. But so what it was about was a lawsuit against these idiotic occupational licensing laws that I didn't even get to talk about, but it was about eyebrow threading and about hair braiding and about florists and trying to kill these oppressive regulations. But there's something sort of Lochner-ish to the lawsuits. It's saying, oh, you can't regulate just to protect an incumbent business. And there were liberal journalists who were taking the side of saying, we can't let these monopoly protection regulations be killed because we have to draw the line and fight for all regulations at all points. Because it's so, I'm not saying no, I'm just saying there are obstacles that are big to your left-right alliance. Some of my best friends are liberals. I'm from Greenwich Village. I go on MSNBC all the time. I want it to work, but it's a lot harder than you might think.
There's also, it's important to pick the right phrase. And I've seen polling that both right and left, if you use the word corporate capitalism or crony capitalism, it doesn't have the response that you get when you use the word corporate welfare. corporate welfare, and I saw focus group was also polling, and man, with corporate welfare, those dials go up right and left. There's something gnawing about a corporation getting welfare. Corporate capitalism is not easily as easily understood as
I never
as
understood
that.
actually why did we drop the term corporate welfare. Actually, I think it's a great term.
Yeah.
It's a really great term. But
Everyone in favor of corporate welfare, raise your hand.
In favor of
yeah. I will
favor of
say,
the term.
I will say this about. I will say this. What's interesting about what's hard about this issue is like a lot of the on the right people are pro-business, and because they're not necessarily well informed or principled, down they're just diehard pro-business, and their pro-business side expresses itself in the form of corporate welfare. By saying, oh, we are super pro-business, so of course we should have lower rates for, companies to come to our states. Of course we're so pro-business that we should have export subsidies to nail those Europeans who compete with us. And of course we should have, these other export subsidies because we can't have foreign companies bringing stuff. On the left, on the other hand, where you would think that it's a natural fight for them, they're as bad, but for completely different reasons. They're like on the Export-Import Bank, they were the biggest corporatists of them all.
Every House Democrat and every Senate Democrat, but Bernie Sanders.
And on the House, on the House side, it was the Florida dude.
Yeah, I don't even like to admit that
Greg,
he was on our side.
He was
Alan
actually on our
Grayson,
side,
yeah.
and he was. So it was 1-1, and the whole. It's a whole. It was Grayson.
Alan Grayson.
Yeah.
Not Grayson Allen.
Yeah. So so it just kind of it's crazy. It's like and they were trying to kind of cover their tracks and saying, well, it's because of the small business aspect of it. But the small business aspect of it, when you trace the money, it's like.
Well, they do have a powerful argument. I don't agree with it, but they argue based on patriotism. Our guys are up against the global competition, and so.
And then German company Siemens is the #3 recipient of the.
Yeah. In the same way as GE is in the top 10 beneficiary of France's COFAS, which is the equivalent.
Well, I've argued the other side of that and said, look, if we want to really go into corporate welfare the way the Europeans do, then ask yourself, do you really want the European economy? Take a look at it. It's not a dynamic economy. They go. I mean, Brussels goes to bat for those companies.
Yeah.
And but it hasn't exactly worked out, and you can make a case that Japanese have a similar situation. It hasn't worked. I mean that kind of support system, that subsidy sounds great, but I don't think the inside. But it is a tough argument because it's like we want to be. It's not small versus large companies in America. It's our guys, our big companies are at the forefront of a global battle, and why shouldn't we do what other companies do? And it's a tough argument.
Yeah. And I'll end by saying that one of the reasons why, and I would say Tim knows this, why it's such a hard fight to fight is because, like with every government programs, right? You can clearly identify the beneficiaries, right? And they are more than willing to actually go on the Hill and testify for how great this program is doing for them. How, without the Export-Import Ban, they could not have increased their business abroad, blah, blah, blah. Without, and it's true for everything. Without this stimulus, they couldn't have hired this person and all this. What's hard is you don't see all the unseen victims of the privilege. And because first, the interests are not concentrated like they are for the beneficiaries, it's spread, and very often the victim themselves, they don't even know that they're victims. It's like if the price of your tickets, your airline tickets is higher because of this, a small share, first you probably don't know for sure, or it's even too small, even if you were like, you knew which share of it, like 2 cents or whatever, it's like the incentives for you to actually, it's not there to go on the hill but the other side, when they have to protect their perks, they will do fly-in. They'll get like 200 beneficiaries and they will fly them
On a subsidized plane.
yeah. And they will fly in and they will go see their representative and so it's really hard. But that's true for all government programs, and this is how the government grows, right? It concentrates benefit and it disperses the cost.
And there's this little side issue here that I find very, very troubling, but if you look at the major media companies in America, so many of them now are the ownership structures, very large companies. And you look at the connections between those large companies and issues that are not covered or issues that are covered. There are large companies I know that are media companies will not really invite you on if you are overly critical of China, because the Chinese keep lists, and they come in and you know, you'd feel the pressure. I think you see a number now. We have high-tech guys owning papers. To what extent do those papers report and do things where there's a subtle influence because of the potential regulation or financial aspects of the internet?
I'm gonna stick out. Jeff Bezos is. I mean, we are a much smaller paper than the Washington Post, but they're a competitor. He's something of a libertarian. I don't think he's a libertarian, but he's something of one. And I'm gonna say I thank God that the guy who owns Amazon is something of a libertarian. And I don't think I've seen him steer Washington Post coverage in favor of his business interests. Now maybe there's something I'm missing. Maybe there's
no, not his business interest. But
$610 million.
with the CIA. I gotta get one of those. Yeah.
I thought you were saying he's a
I've
political.
got time for one more
use.
question, and I'm going to turn to this gentleman here.
Yeah, that would be nice.
Wait for the.
How many comments to FAA? Yeah, I can talk loudly.
Yeah.
It really doesn't matter. Okay, thanks.
Take it, please.
I wanted comments on the Trump administration regulatory budgeting schemes. That's it.
Wait.
The 2-for-1 regulation, zero incremental cost. I mean, these are attempts to rein in the regulatory state. And, you know, there's been a lot of talk about crony capitalism, but really what it relates to is the regulatory state.
Yeah.
And that's been like a common theme. I would say a little bit more than taxes at this point in time.
Yes.
And from my perspective, the regulatory state is frankly a much more important lever, I think, for conservatives than taxes, just to be frank.
Yeah, so I will say this, it's like I don't know where the Trump administration, what the Trump administration will have achieved in 4 years, but whatever it is they will have achieved, they will have done more, right? In ways that are uncomparable. I mean, you can't compare to other administration in deregulating the economy. So his executive orders, I think, have accomplished a lot, but also something that the newspapers never talk about is the fact that Congress has used the CRA 14 CRA, yeah. 14 times already. 14 times. And it just actually
that's to eliminate.
Yeah, to eliminate a regulation entirely, right? So he suspended, when he arrived, he put a moratorium, the Obama regulation for the last 6 months of his administration. It's just actually pretty amazing because usually no one cares about regulation. People, even people who are interested in regulation are bored by regulation. I mean, it's
But I worry about there's a divergent. It's not necessarily the same, because you're not going to get rid of all the bad regulations. There's going to be priorities. CRA, you could only do regulations issued in the last months of or weeks of the Obama administration, and they did a good job on that. But as they go forward, are they going to focus on the regulations that create the most economic distortions and impose the most costs, or the regulations that are most subjected to by the big businesses who have access to the White House. And Trump is the kind of guy who's going to have CEOs in there, and he's going to be like, by the way, what bugs you? Oh, that? And then he'll turn to his staff and he'll say, you guys jump on that. And that might only bug Exxon, or that might only bug Apple, or that, and it might not be the most. So I'm not an expert on this, but that's what I would worry about, is that are they going to focus on the ones that are most economically destructive, or are they going to focus on the ones that bug the guys with access most? And we've talked tonight about why those might be two very different things.
And one other thing, question, will they become bogged down in the courts?
I mean, in my opinion, the worst regulations are statutory rather than from the administrative state itself. Because under Obama, they shut down a lot of the economists groups. They were like, all right, well, this is what we're gonna do, and you're gonna find benefits to make this thing pass. And if you don't find benefits, we'll give it to McKinsey, and they're gonna find benefits. So, in my opinion, the statutory rules. Okay, in general, the economists do a good job. If you empower us, we'll shut a lot of shit down. But the statutory rules you can't shut down, and those tend to be worse. Those are things which, for instance, there's a rule which was motivated by like
Use the microphone.
Oh, there's a rule that was motivated by like an airplane crash in 2010, and no one ever heard of it, but the victims really want something passed. And we have to write these regulatory reviews, and they say things like, there are no benefits to this rule, but it is statutory. Therefore, we have judged the costs to be $2.5 billion, about that much, and that's what it's going to be. And therefore, it passes the cost-benefit test, because anything which is statutory passes the cost-benefit test regardless.
Yeah.
So that's why I wanted comments on current policy, because I'm in the administration now, and I just want to hear
We've actually run out of time, and I'm going to give Boyden the last word if you have anything to sum up or any comment or observation.
Well, I think there is a danger. Trump tried to put Carl Icahn in charge of regulation, and Carl Icahn was trying to use that power to fix a problem he had in one of his companies, and that's just totally the wrong thing, and thank God it didn't happen. It would have been a huge scandal. I think this administration, as Veronique has said, is going to really clean house, and that's maybe more hope than a prediction, but that's what I hope. But I agree with you. It's very, very important. And I'll just end by saying, Stanley Marcus, who's out at Home Depot, will tell you, and has told audiences all over the country, I could not start Home Depot today. And that goes back to David's point about startups and innovation. I could not do Home Depot today, and that is a really scary proposition. So.
Yeah, that's terrible. Thank you so much. Boyden, Dave, Tim, Veronique, thank you so much. Appreciate it.